Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Leeds Climate Conversation. I'm Polly Billington. I'm the director of UK 100. I think there's a slide that pretends that I'm Andy Goldring from Leeds University. But unfortunately, Andy has been taken very ill today. So he's lying flat in a darkened room. And so they asked me if I would do this bit of this evening. So I'm going to do quite a lot. I've got to make sure that we all know what we're doing this evening. So if I can just get you through the housekeeping before we get to the interesting bit, this still means this is important, not necessarily interesting. Okay, so we're not expecting a fire alarm. If you hear one, please leave by the marked fire exits. There are 3 from this building. Via the front entrance where you came in. The rallying point is outside the Baines wing. I suspect more people here will know where the Baines wing than I do, so if there is a fire alarm, please take me there. Via the side entrance, the rallying point is outside the Great Hall. Via the rear entrance, where the Carbon Cafe is, the rallying point is by the Emmanuel Church. Now, please follow the stewards. Hopefully, you won't need any of that information, but retain it anyway. Now, phones and devices, I know we will all be very keen to tweet, and we've got the hashtag Big Leeds Climate Conversation. But can you have them on silent, all electronic devices, especially phones? There are toilets on either side of the main entrance as well as on the first floor. Please follow the signs. This event is being live streamed because although there are lots of people in this room, there is not as many people as we need to have in this conversation, so it's being live streamed. Okay, and key sections will be uploaded to the Leeds Climate Commission website. If you don't want to be filmed, please move now to the back of the lecture theatre, or at some point slightly more discreetly. I don't mind which way you do it. And if you have to leave before the end, please leave via one of the rear doors at the top of the lecture theatre, just so that we don't have people coming and going, because we have a great lineup for you this evening. Remember that this is the beginning of a months and months of conversations. It's running until October. So this is just the start of that conversation that's going to be happening across Leeds over the next few months so that we can get to a settled view about what we should be doing. So I will just run through briefly what's going to happen between now, 6:30, and 7:10, so that you know what's going on, and then we'll have the breakout groups. So you're going to hear from, let me go in the right order. First, you're going to hear from Keely Donovan from the BBC Look North about local climate impacts. She knows a lot about that as a weather presenter. She will be talking to us about that. We've got a film of her. Then we're going to hear from Professor Andy Challoner about the global climate impact. Then we're going to hear from Councillor Lisa Mulherin about what we need to do here in Leeds now. And then we're going to hear from Professor Andy Goulson, all the professors, all the Andys, about how we turn that ambition into reality, a route map to net zero. And then we're going to hear from a business. We're going to hear from Richard Flint of Yorkshire Water, and then we're going to hear from the grassroots. We've got 2 people speaking from the grassroots organisations in Leeds who are campaigning on climate. Tim Jones from Our Future Leeds and Rizwan Nawaz from the Medina Town Movement. So that means there are no surprises for you guys between now and 7:30. What I do need to remind you also is that we have Laura. Now, Laura's there. Laura, can you explain what you're going to be doing? Because people need to, again, no surprises, and it'll give them an idea about how we're going to capture all of these brilliant ideas.
Press the red button at the bottom. Yeah, press that.
Yeah.
That was my first challenge, and I've passed the test, so I'm pleased. Hello, everybody. I'm Laura from Nifty Fox Creative, and my job is to make the complex simple through the power of pictures, or a posh way of saying, I doodle, and it makes sense to you. Does that sound okay? Yay, some audience participation, I love it. So what I'll be doing today is taking all of the ideas, action points, and wonderful experiences we have and making them visual into pictures on this screen here. And as Polly has already mentioned, please use the hashtag Big Leeds Climate Conversation, tag in at Leeds Climate Com, I think it is, with 2 M's, and also at Nifty Fox Creative as well. All of these images that I do today will be made available after the event via a JPEG file, so a picture file, and a PDF, so we can share it after the event and use something to drive that conversation forward from today. Sound good? Let's go.
Thanks very much, Laura. OK, we're going to start with that film from Keely Donovan.
Hello, I'm Keely Donovan, and I'm a weather presenter for BBC Look North, mainly forecasting for Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Now, weather and climate are different, of course. We can't say for certain that any one particular weather event is down to climate change, but projections say that as our climate continues to warm, there will be extreme weather more often, which of course comes in many different forms. Let's cast our minds back to this time last month. Our weather was very unsettled, and a slow-moving area of low pressure almost ground to a halt over the British Isles, in particular over Lincolnshire. The equivalent of 2 months' worth of rain fell in just 2 days and caused the River Steeping to burst its banks. Nearly 600 homes in and around the Lincolnshire town of Wainfleet were evacuated. Thousands of acres of farmland were ruined and hundreds of livelihoods affected. It said the clean-up could take months, devastating for homeowners.
I've come back for the first time to look what's happened. My son's been looking after it for me, but he's only been able to wade down there. 45 years. I came here in 1974. 45 years and never expected anything like this.
For farmers, some who lost entire crops, the implications could be ongoing.
The whole of South Lincolnshire is impacted by what could be a nearly like a disaster scenario in terms of food production, because we've never had it like this.
A stark contrast to this time last year, the summer of 2018, the joint hottest summer on record for the UK and the hottest ever for England. The heat wave saw soaring temperatures across much of the UK throughout June and July, and it was the driest start to summer on record. England's green and pleasant land quickly turned brown. Bad news for many farmers. For dairy farmers like John Hill in the Pennines, who feeds his cows silage, cut grass, this is turning into a significant issue.
At the first glance, you look at the field and you think, oh, there's quite a lot of grass, but when you actually walk into it, there is no bottom grass to it,
Yeah,
so
you
there's
can
nothing
see, you're
to
absolutely right. From this perspective, looking across the horizon,
Yeah,
it looks quite
yeah.
lush, but yeah, this just tells a different story,
The
doesn't it?
colour's there, the nutrients are all there to go. It's lacking water. We're feeding the winter rations as now, mid-August. Serious, yeah.
Veg farmers are also at the mercy of the weather, as Lincolnshire potato farmer Julian Perrone told me.
70–80% dead now. It's regularly here in Lincolnshire seeing temperatures around 28, 29, 30, 31, day in, day out.
So go on, let's have a look at these.
So let's have a look at these. These should be double the size.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, you see, I
Yeah.
just thought these were, I
Yeah.
almost thought these were new potatoes, actually.
Yeah, these should be all baking sizes.
And what does that mean for you, then? Does it mean that you don't get the same price for them?
They'll sell, but they won't be worth so much money if they had got a bigger size on them.
At the end of last year, the Met Office announced that human-induced climate change made the 2018 record-breaking summer about 30 times more likely to occur than it would have done naturally, and that by the middle of this century, hot and dry summers could become very common, happening around 50% of the time. But conversely, climate predictions also say that when the rain comes in winter or when thunderstorms develop in summer, there's more energy available to them, so they'll hold and deposit more water, and therefore the incidence of heavy rain and flooding will become more frequent too. Now, as a forecaster, I usually love a good statistic or a record, but there's something rather unsettling about the frequency they are now occurring.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Now, we've had some of that's pretty shocking, I think, and everyone would agree, especially when it's got the impact both on our food and on can we now hear from Professor Andy Challoner, who's going to now put this in a global context? So this isn't just happening in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, of course it's happening across the world. Andy.
Thanks very much. The mic on? Yes, good. Okay, so am I going to scare you? I've been wondering this all day, incidentally. I'm still not quite sure what's going to happen. Let's find out. So I'm going to start by asking you a question. Do any of you need convincing that this is a serious problem? Right, so I imagine that was the case. I'm going to ask you another question in a minute, which I also asked when I went to the UNFCCC to submit evidence to their advisory group, basically on adaptation, and so to do with crops and climate change and things we can do and solutions we can have. And so the first thing I said to them was, is people aware there's an emergency going on? And some people looked up from their phones, and one guy went, like that. And then I said, because I think this is important, then I said to them, how many of you feel it? I didn't know, how many of you feel it? Ooh. And kind of the guy who'd helped me organise the meeting went, yeah, and everyone else went, oh dear. So you've been warned now. I'm asking you, it's a serious question. How many of you feel it? Yeah. Quite a lot. Of course you do, because that's why you're here, right? So this isn't well, hopefully it'd be great if everyone thought like this, right? I think it's that's really important, which isn't what I've been asked to talk about, but I will get onto it. So sorry about that. Right, let's have a look at, have I got a slide to talk about? Yes, I have, good. So this is, it's a few years old now, but and you could say the updated evidence is probably kind of even worse. Take a little bit of explaining. We've got 2 bars for each decade. Blue is good, red is bad, dark red is worse than light red, dark blue is better than light blue. So 2010 now, in theory, see this was a few years ago, it's probably out of date, even that bar, you could probably say that. Sort of 50-50 good, bad impacts of climate change on crop yields, globally, we're looking globally now, including adaptation and various other things. I'm not going to go into the techie side of it. But from the sort of 2030s onwards, you can see the balance shifts. We've got far more yields going down than we have got yields going up, and it's getting darker red, and by the end of the century, it's kind of almost black. The other important thing about this figure, maybe if you hit space, that might become a reality. There we go. So I could have said that just as easily. Tropical regions are, by and large, being hit worse and temperate. And so the mostly temperate regions have got these, hang on. It's a while since I've talked about this slide. Tropical and temperate regions, sorry, in the early part of the century, and mostly temperate regions being hit, having the only positive yield increases in the second half, is what I mean. So there are some, even if you don't follow that garbled version, there are different impacts happening in different places and at different times, and that is what really is going to be what the impacts of climate change are about, not these means. So this is a global picture saying globally things are bad, but actually it's things like beginnings of things we're seeing, like food price spikes when there's a big climate event in Russia that wipes out the wheat, and as a result of that, Russia says, hold on, export ban, let's make sure we keep the wheat here. Food prices go up, this has knock-on effects elsewhere. So we actually wrote this into the UK climate change risk assessment when we wrote this a few years ago. The third cycle is underway at the moment. And I still remember that I probably won't need to look at my notes for this bit. The government response to the report that we wrote was we accept all of the conclusions, we accept the conclusions on food security of the report, with the exception of some of those on food security. In this phrase, we take a more optimistic view of the functioning of markets. And as I was reading that, yeah, I'm not going to get political, but as I was reading that, there were it was a salad crisis, how badly you want to think of that. But most of our salads come from, a lot of our salad comes from Murcia. There were extreme events, there were hailstorms, there were all sorts of things happening, and the supply chains weren't quite right to ensure that the supermarkets were stocked up with salads. I don't know if you remember that, a little over a year ago. And that was exactly what we were talking about in the report. So yeah. So winners and losers, just this story. Yeah. So not a lot else to say. Well, the other thing we did in the fifth assessment report is the first evidence of observed impacts on crop yields. So attributing decreasing yield trends to climate. And actually, more recent study I was involved in showed that crop breeding across Africa isn't keeping up with that trend that's tending to decrease yields. So these things are now being observed, and I think being observed more quicker, certainly than I expected to. And some people I've spoken to, even sort of people who advise government and other profs and whatever, people have said to me, well, now you only need to look out the window. And okay, I'm not putting any error bars on these statements, right? But we remember February, you remember, just thinking about here, remember February, remember Easter. I kind of feel like it's summer 2020 or something at the moment. So I think that's more or less all I wanted to say, except that just to go back to that issue, I do think it's important that we don't just understand and hold these things in our heads, that we actually feel it in some way. And I think to do that actually requires a lot of courage. And I think that's one of the really important and central things. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, I wasn't surprised that everybody knows it's an emergency. I wasn't surprised that everybody feels it, but the reality is we've got to do something about it. So we're going to hear from Councillor Lisa Mulherin, who is the new, comparatively freshly appointed portfolio holder for climate, which is fantastic to have a city which puts it so much in prominence in the Cabinet. Would you like to come up?
Thank you, Polly. Hopefully that's working. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm Lisa Mulherin. I'm a Leeds City Councillor, and I'm 7 weeks into my new role as the first Executive Member for Climate Change, Transport and Sustainable Development at Leeds City Council. So I'd like to start by saying a big thank you to our partners at Leeds Climate Commission for organising tonight's event to kickstart the city's big conversation on climate change. It's great to see so many people here from communities across Leeds, and to see so many people engaged in what we need to do to tackle the climate emergency. We face a monumental issue, as Andy's outlined, one that will affect the most vulnerable and least affluent in our society the most. And it's important that we work together as a city to achieve our carbon neutral ambitions. So why did Leeds declare a climate emergency? Most of you in the room, as we've already identified, are engaged in this agenda. And you know that a landmark report by the UN warned that unless urgent action is taken in the next 10 years, the opportunity to avoid the worst effects of climate change cannot be avoided. Leeds will not be immune from these effects, as flooding, droughts and extreme temperatures become more likely, as we saw in the video from Keely Donovan earlier. Leeds will not be immune, and we are seeing a massive decline in the population of bees and other pollinating insects, even in our own city, and an increasing number of species around the world threatened and endangered. In response to these findings, Leeds City Council formally declared a climate emergency in March this year and has committed to work to be a carbon neutral city by 2030. Over recent years, Leeds City Council's carbon footprint has significantly reduced. Despite shrinking council budgets, the council has invested in cleaner, greener technologies, such as ultra-low emission vehicles for our own fleet, home insulation and energy improvements for our council housing stock, and low-energy LED street lighting. But as we've declared a climate emergency, we recognise we need to do a whole lot more. Becoming a carbon-neutral city will require huge changes to the way that we all live and work. We need to reduce our emissions as much as we can and plant trees and greenery to absorb any emissions that we cannot reduce and support our wildlife. Tackling climate change is the greatest environmental challenge we face. It won't be possible without the widespread support of the government, of the private, voluntary and public sector, and, most importantly, our citizens. However, it's also an unprecedented opportunity to improve the quality of life for people and shape a city that is healthier, more sustainable and fairer for everyone. The Big Leeds Climate Conversation is a mass engagement campaign starting tonight with every community in Leeds to develop a citywide plan to tackle climate change. It's being delivered in partnership with the independent Leeds Climate Commission and is a part of the Council's response to its declaration of a climate emergency. As well as an online questionnaire, the Big Leeds Climate Conversation will involve conversations with residents and organisations across the city, from our summer programme of children and young people's events, at the Breeze events across the summer, at Leeds Pride in August, our city's Great West Indian Carnival, tenants forums across the city and many others, so that the great diversity of our city is reflected in the conversation that we're holding. We know that for us to secure unprecedented local commitments to tackle climate change, it's critical that we bring those who aren't in this room, who aren't already fully aware of the needs to tackle the climate emergency with us. We're also looking at our own emissions to develop an organisational roadmap developed with the Climate Commission to become a carbon neutral council, and we're asking the other 9 biggest carbon emitters in the city to do the same. Together, we're responsible for 15% of the city's carbon emissions. Every organisation has a part to play, and that's why tonight we're announcing a new £150,000 funding competition to help employers in Leeds reduce car journeys from our roads. This is a fantastic opportunity for big employers in the city to make a difference. Every weekday morning, it's estimated that 60,000 people drive into Leeds alone, causing congestion, worsening air pollution and damaging health. If they all cycled, worked or used public transport, we could make a very significant difference. We're also working hard to improve public transport in Leeds as part of the Connecting Leeds and long-term city-region connectivity transport strategies. Over the next few years, we'll be transforming our city centre to prioritise walking, cycling and public transport. And over the next few months, I'm pleased to announce plans for a programme of car-free days in communities across the Leeds district, starting with 3 in September on the World Car Free Day, 2 in our inner city district centres and 1 in an outer lying area. This will be a rolling programme continuing into next year. Finally, as we formally launch the City Conversation tonight, I'd like to ask for the support of everyone in this room who's already engaged in this agenda to become a climate champion, to take the questionnaire, share it with your families, friends, neighbours, colleagues at work, and join us at the events that are taking place over the next 3 months to engage the rest of the City of Leeds and to get them to help us to tackle the climate emergency. Thank you.
Thank you. Political commitment like that is what we call a necessary but not sufficient. So we need to work out how we're going to shift from that declaration to delivery. Now we'll hear from Professor Andy Goulson about the Leeds, from the Leeds Climate Commission, about what the route map will look like for Leeds.
It's still not working? Yeah, there we go. It's fantastic to see so many of you here today. The Leeds Climate Commission has been working for a few years with lots of the organisations and communities across the city to get a grip of this issue, I suppose, build capacities and celebrate progress. However, we know that this is a massive, massive challenge. What I'm going to show you tonight, some of you may have already seen, is our kind of prototype carbon roadmap. The good news is it shows that we can respond to this issue. What we need from you is lots and lots of advice through this conversation on what kind of transition you want. This is absolutely crucial that for Leeds as a city, this is done by us and with us, not to us, if you see what I mean. This transition has to be a very kind of inclusive and participatory one. Do you have the click? Okay, thanks. So where are we as a city so far in terms of progress made, and where are we headed by the key dates? Thank you. Okay. So since 1990, which is where most of the kind of measurement starts, we're actually nearly 50% down as a city on our on our carbon emissions. Kind of excluding our consumption patterns, they're also coming down, but they're still higher. And by 2050, if we factor in all of the kind of reductions in electricity, carbon intensity, and that kind of thing, which the UK has already committed to, we think as a city we'll be 56% down. So that's kind of good. Some reasons to think that that's good progress up to a point, but clearly there's much more that needs to be done, and all the new science that's coming out says we need to be much more ambitious, much more urgent in the way that we deliver this. So when we look at what global carbon budgets mean when you translate them down to Leeds on a per capita basis, so this is dividing up all the kind of climate space around the world and saying, well, Leeds with a population of, nearly 800,000 people, our share of that is the same as any other population around the world. What it would mean is that our emissions come down by that dotted line. And to put that in context, what that means is if we're 40 to 50% down now on where we were 20, 30 years ago, in the next 10 years, we need to double that. We need to get to 85% carbon cuts by 2030 as a minimum, and to work towards the more ambitious target of becoming net zero or carbon neutral by 2030. That involves radical, deep cutting changes to many aspects of what we do across the city. It also means that we have a massive gap between where we're headed and where we need to be. And the key question for us as a commission was, can we close that gap? How can we do that? Some of the good news is that half of that gap we can close using all the things we already know about. So these are not rocket science, these are not breakthrough technologies, these are insulating roofs, upgrading vehicles, more active transport and so on. So that first half technically is pretty easy. It shouldn't be that complicated. And that means we've got 5 or so years to pursue these options really aggressively and at the same time develop capacities for delivering the second bit. The second chunk is more challenging. It's not economic. It may become economic in time, but at the moment it's more costly and it's more technically challenging and it's more socially challenging and it's more politically challenging. So it gets harder as we get deeper into this transition. But even after we did all of that lot, it would still lead us to 2/3 of a carbon reduction, with the last third being where the big challenge is. So what we did as a commission was to say, well, where are the kind of innovative options that we could think of that would further close that gap? And we identified 7 or 8. If you're interested in more detail, it's all on our website in the Leeds Carbon Roadmap. That would completely close the gap. So these are things like rolling out hydrogen, heating across the city, aggressive retrofit of domestic and non-domestic buildings, doubling the rate of adoption of electric vehicles, accelerating district heat rollout, all of these kind of things. Again, you know, they're things that we know about. We're not sure how expensive they would be. We're not sure what challenges we would reach along the way, but they are doable. So the good news is we know it's possible. And as I said earlier, this is a kind of prototype. But what we need from you is guidance. We need to know, what are the guiding principles for delivering this kind of stuff? Are there other ideas that we've overlooked? Are there things that are more desirable or less desirable, or more equitable and inclusive and less equitable and inclusive? So for me, a large point of tonight and of the broader conversation is to get that feedback from the public, from all sections of the city, on how we deliver this and what kind of ways we should be pursuing these ambitious carbon reductions. We haven't quite got the final funding in place yet, but we're very close to being able to announce a citizens' jury for the city, which the Commission would be running in the autumn, which would be a much more detailed dive into this process. And I know that's a core demand of Extinction Rebellion, looking at your badge on your shoulder. And we're thrilled to be able to do that and think that will give us a much more kind of representative deep dive, if you like, into what the city wants out of this climate transition. The key point, as I said earlier, is that this is done by us and with us, not to us. And we need to mobilize and become active in delivering the kind of transition that we want.
Thank you very much, Andy. By us and with us, not to us. I think we need to remember that as we have the conversations this evening. Next, we're going to hear from Richard Flint from Yorkshire Water as an example of business leading the way. Richard?
Hello, can you hear me? This is obviously working. Great, thank you. Good evening, my name is Richard Flint and I'm the Chief Executive of Yorkshire Water. Just really very briefly, what does Yorkshire Water do, which is, I guess, fairly obvious really, but we have the responsibility to provide safe, clean drinking water to the whole of Yorkshire and then take the waste, clean it and return it to the environment. We have to do that 24 hours a day, every day of the year. And that involves serving 5 million people who live in 2 million houses and 140,000 businesses. To do that, we have lots and lots of heavy infrastructure, which to put in plain language means lots of reservoirs, lots of treatment works, lots of pipes, lots of tanks, more pipes, more treatment works, and then a return to the environment. In fact, enough pipe to wrap around the world twice, which is one of those kind of things that I find interesting, but clearly no one in this room does either. So really, so what are we doing? We necessarily are a big emitter of carbon. We emit somewhere in the region of 280,000 tons of carbon a year in order to provide that service. And it's because we are very energy intensive. We're very technologically driven, and that's been a product of needing to hit tighter and tighter quality and environmental standards quite rightly. Hitting those targets, hitting those levels of service are there to ensure public health and to protect the environment and give people the environment that, frankly, in the 5th largest economy in the world, everybody should expect to experience every day. But there's a challenge for us, and of course that's how to move away from that really significant carbon intensity into a world where we are a carbon neutral business, and in fact to look beyond that to see how we can become a net absorber of carbon beyond getting past that point of neutrality. So we as a company have committed to carbon neutrality by 2030. And in fact, the whole of the water sector, all water companies in England, have also committed to achieving that by 2030. Now, that is a very, very real and significant challenge for us. And do we know the answer in terms of how to get there all in one go? Clearly, no, we don't. But there are some things that we can do on a very, very practical level. And turning to Leeds, our single biggest investment in the last 5 years across the whole of the region has been in Leeds in the construction of our anaerobic digestion plant at Nostrop, which we've just recently finished constructing at a price of £75 million. It's next to the wind turbine, which is also on our site down there. There is, however, I think another stage beyond that. Beyond 2030, we need to be looking at absorption. And the way we think we can do that is through our commitment to woodland restoration. We're going to plant 1 million trees over the next 10 years. We're going to restore peatland. We're one of the biggest landowners in Yorkshire, and use that as a method to do a number of things, to return biodiversity to the uplands of Yorkshire and make sure that we absorb carbon to make sure we play our part in reducing and getting to neutrality and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. And finally, and arguably most importantly, now we've seen all of the science and what can be done, the view from the grassroots. We've got Tim Jones and Rizwan Nawaz, who are both going to come up. Have you got, is Rizwan here? Yeah. Great. And they're going to take the floor between them for about 5 minutes to talk about how they've been campaigning and what they think needs to be done.
Hi, I'm Tim Jones from Our Future Leeds, and we are representing the grassroots, which, Rizwan, I don't know if you agree, but I think that makes it sound a lot cooler than we probably are. Our Future Leeds is a group of individuals and organisations that's come together to respond at a civic level to Leeds City Council's declaration of a climate emergency. Now, we're very, very conscious about the fact that we don't have the answers to this big emergency that we're in. But we do have a pretty solid set of beliefs. We believe that we really, really need to act very, very quickly to respond to this emergency. We believe that we need to protect life in all of its forms, both human and non-human life, in the city of Leeds and beyond. And we also believe that everybody has a right, a democratic right, to be part of the solutions that are going to be the things that sort out the problems that we're in. So some people here might be wondering why Our Future Leeds needs to exist in the light of some of the really great things that we're hearing tonight that the Council and the Climate Commission are doing. Well, we very definitely want to work alongside the Climate Commission and the Council on all of the areas that we feel they are responding urgently enough to the situations that are arising. However, we also want to really help them and complement them by building the democratic mandate in the city for faster and more urgent action on climate change. We want to reach into every community in this city to really hear from the grassroots and to allow the different communities to respond in the ways that those communities want to respond. And it's been really heartening to hear that those aims are shared by so many other people here tonight. But we also want to hold people to account, hold the powers that be to account, because individual action is not going to be enough to sort out the problems that we're in. We really need strong collective action. And so that's why Our Future Leeds is going to be setting up a climate hub in the city, where people, a physical space in the city centre, where people are going to be able to come to learn about the climate emergency, learn what they can do, both as individuals and collectively. And if you want to get involved in that, we'd love to have you on board. You'll see up here that we have an event on at the Old Bridge Street Church in the city centre, July the 27th, 10 a.m. till 2 p.m. It's going to be a great planning day. There's going to be 4 different workshops, and it'd be really good to have everybody's input into all of the conversations that we're having. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So too much technology.
That's for the slides if you need them.
Okay, thank you. So, I think everyone can hear me. I wear various hats, but today I'll be representing the Medina Town movement. So I am a climate change researcher. In fact, I did my PhD about 15 years ago on climate change. I'm a visiting researcher at the University of Sheffield. I work here as well at the University of Leeds. But today I'm stepping into the shoes of my colleague Adnan Ashfaq, who was down to talk about this. He has spearheaded this movement. It's called the Medina Town Movement. And really, what it's about engaging a certain part of the community. In this case, in the case of Medina Town Movement, it is the Muslim community. So faith, I think, we believe has a great role to play. And there was a survey done by the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Management some years ago, where they asked, it was about 100 or plus participants, what are the big changes, what are the big effective ways of engaging communities? And faith came out on top. And it has consistently shown to be something that can engage communities globally. And there is an organization that I've been sort of part of in the past as well, and it has huge successes. It's called the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Science. So in the 60 seconds that I've got left, I haven't even moved past the title. So just the basic principles of the Medina Town movement is based on 5 pillars: justice, peace, compassion, freedom, and unity. So it's the unity bit I think I'm particularly keen to push forward. And these are sort of from the Quranic, from scripture, and people can really connect with scripture, and that's where the behavioral changes come in. So unity, hold firmly to the rope of Allah, God, all together, and do not become divided. And remember the favor of God upon you. When you were enemies and he brought your hearts together and you became, by his favour, one. So it's about getting together, it's about uniting. And the recent cricket is actually a good example of that unity. It's taken England a long time to win a cricket World Cup.
Don't rub it in.
But it's been successful because of the diversity. It's people working together. We had an Irishman, we had a West Indian, we had a New Zealander, we had 2 Pakistani origin players. So it's about working together, and that's what we hope to do with the Medina Town movement. Maybe I've got some time. It says stop. Sorry. One last thing. If you do want to know the last slide. Sorry, the last slide. If you can just go on to the last one. If you do want to know more, there is a book. Just do a quick plug for this book. It's written by my sort of mentor, Fazlun Khalid, and I'm hoping to organise a talk around that book in this very venue in November. It's a tentative date, 12th of November. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Now, Rizwan is experiencing the demands of everyone having to have an opportunity to speak. That means that not everyone can speak for as long as they'd like, which is very frustrating for all of us. But now we're going to go into the breakout sessions, which gives an opportunity for you to start speaking, having heard all of that information. Tom Noland from Leeds City Council, can you explain the breakout sessions a bit?
Yep. Are we getting an intro to the game show before everyone goes, or not? Just when people decide to stay here?
You can mention it.
Okay, right. If you want, so there's a number of different activities now. Take the microphone. If you want to play the big carbon literacy game show, stay in here, okay? That's why there are balloons, okay? So you have been warned. If, however, and you might have signed up for some of these, if you want to talk about food and food waste, then go into LG10, which is that way, where the food was, appropriately enough. If you want to talk about sustainable transport, go into LG19, which is that way. If you want to talk about finance and projects, go to LG15, which is also that way. And there are also lots of interactive activities in the Carbon Cafe area at the back, where some of you might have been earlier on. There will be someone there who will explain the topic to you, and then there will be an opportunity for you to respond to a couple of questions. Could we have you back in here, please? I know time is tight, by 20 to 8.
I think actually we can give them another 10 minutes because we're going to drop something.
Oh, don't worry. They'll take ages to come back anyway.
So just give us a few minutes and then we'll be starting with the big carbon literacy game show. But if there's a chance for you to take a comfort break and have a quick drink and come back soon, and Polly is going to tell you about this and we're going to play a wonderful game.
I've been playing what was it? Play Your Carbon Right earlier at Yorkshire Waters Conference. We're going to use it for Breeze. Staying. Do you want to come sort of sit a bit nearer the front so we're not spread out quite so far for this session, please? Please come down. The price is right. We're getting the game show mood. No, they're still not moving.
No, we're very British. We don't like audience participation stuff. Is anyone a climate scientist? If you're a climate scientist, you're in the wrong room. Because this is an introductory activity, but we thought it was an interesting thing to show you.
So, are we starting now?
Yeah, let's crack on.
Right, okay.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm Polly Cook and I work for Leeds City Council. I head up our response to the climate emergency. So just giving a quick introduction to Dave, who is from the Carbon Literacy Project, who's going to lead this activity. And really from a council's perspective, as Councillor Mulherron's already laid out, actually improving the carbon literacy of the city is absolutely critical, because actually if people don't understand the challenge and don't understand the kind of impact of the decisions they're making, actually it's going to be impossible for any organisation to make the level of changes that are required. So actually improving the carbon literacy for us is one of the key ambitions for the next year. And we will be doing a host of events over the city and inviting people from the general public to come and work alongside us as climate champions to help spread that message, so it's not a council-centric message, that it is genuinely a city message. So I said I'd make my introduction very brief, so I am. So I'm going to hand over to the very skilled Dave Coleman.
I'm mic'd, I'm all good, thank you very much. Carbon literacy is aimed at everyone who lives, works and studies. It's aimed at a general audience. So I know lots of us in the room are already aware of the climate emergency and concerned about that, but just bear that in mind as we talk about what we're going to talk about. Now, my first big test is, can I make the slides move on my own? Did that go ping? Ooh, am I going the wrong way? Oh, it goes that way. Good, that's okay. So, I want you to imagine for a second that you don't know what money is. Imagine for a second you don't know what money is. So you've got money in your pockets and you've got cards and things. Imagine for a second you don't know what that means, what it's like. So you wander out of here and you decide that you're going to get something on the way home because it's quite hot. So you go into a shop and you want to take a drink, but the bloke insists that you give him some kind of token. So you give him, I don't know, something, whatever's in your pocket. He looks pretty happy. You gave him 1,000 of them, but what does he know? Mike's gone off for a second. Am I back? Yeah. So then, I don't know, you decide to get a taxi home because it's getting quite late, and you give the taxi driver another 1,000 of these tokens, and he looks pretty happy as well. But when you get home, you discover that all your belongings are in the street, because apparently you haven't paid some mortgage, and they've taken your house back because you didn't use your tokens in the right way, because you didn't understand really what these tokens were. Imagine what it was like. This might be a bit boomy in a minute, but we'll see. So we got to the point where you got home and you just had your belongings moved out, and it's because you didn't understand what this money thing was. Imagine what it would be like trying to live like that. Imagine trying to have a career or have a job when you couldn't understand whether you were being paid well or badly, how you would buy things, how you'd buy food, how you'd buy a house, how you'd build a career. Imagine trying to run an organisation if you didn't know what money was. Or run a society when we didn't understand the value of anything, when we sold things or bought things, and what was expensive and what was cheap and what mattered and what didn't. Imagine for a second that you don't know what carbon is. Imagine you don't know the energy costs of all of the things that we use day to day. So you don't know what things are really expensive and have a huge impact on the environment, what things you could work really hard to try and save, but actually they make almost no difference at all. Imagine trying to run an organisation where you didn't understand what the carbon consequences of the business model that you chose was, and the products you chose to sell or not to sell, and the way you behaved and the way you moved them and the way you ran your business, or the way we ran society if we didn't understand what carbon was. And obviously you'll know exactly where I'm going with this. We don't really know the carbon costs of everything. We haven't got a natural sense of that. None of us have. And that's one of the reasons why, as a society, we are where we are. Because we kind of understand money, and not everybody even understands money, but really, as a society, we don't know what the carbon costs of things are. We don't know what's important and not. So it's really hard to make informed decisions and choices as a consequence. So, carbon footprint, I think everybody here is going to be familiar with what that term means. Just wave at me. Everybody knows what carbon footprint means? Just wave, yep, okay. So just in case, I brought a definition with me that I'd looked up on Wikipedia, which is the total emissions, how do they word it, caused by an individual event, organisation or product expressed as a carbon dioxide equivalent. Carbon dioxide equivalent is important because there are different greenhouse gases, and we don't talk about methane footprints or we don't talk about nitrous oxide footprints. Everything's converted into carbon so we can talk in one language. But instinctively, none of us know the carbon footprints of things. So I thought I would prove that with the use of some balloons. So bear with me for a second, there's going to be a little bit of table moving. Let's pull this out. We'll get out of the way. Okay. So how many people have a tumble dryer? Does anyone have a tumble dryer? Yeah, quite a few people. Use tumble dryers, they're commonly available domestic items. So imagine, for a second, that you tumble dry about 3 times a week, which apparently is not uncommon for a family. So you end up doing 148 tumble dries per year. What kind of carbon footprint is that? Is that a big carbon footprint? Is that absolutely massive? Because most people know that things that heat things up tend to use a lot of energy, so is that really high? Or is it actually a really meaningless carbon footprint and actually nothing to worry about at all? What do you think? Who thinks it's a really big carbon footprint? There is some audience participation, I should have warned you. I know this is a Yorkshire gritty audience. It doesn't like audience participation, but, so actually, probably half the room, maybe a third. Who thinks it's a really low carbon footprint? Interesting, yep. Brave man there. Who thinks it's a medium carbon footprint or is frightened to put their hand up to any previous question? Okay. So I thought I'd kind of demonstrate it in a more physical way than normal. So I'm going to release this thing. This is going to get really hard now. You're doing it one-handed, holding a microphone. But when I release that balloon, when I finally get the clip off it one-handed, I knew I shouldn't have gone for this mic. There we go. The height of that balloon, come back, corresponds to the carbon footprint. And actually, it's not very much. So the man over here who was brave and said not very much at all was actually right. It's about 300 kilograms of carbon per year. So, if you don't have to tumble dry, don't tumble dry. It's a good thing not to have to do, and it saves a little bit of energy. But in the great scheme of things, oddly, tumble drying, which a lot of people think, oh, bad to use tumble dryers, isn't actually that big a deal. How about meat consumption? How about eating meat? Average daily consumption, apparently, of men, particularly, in the UK, is apparently averages 226 grams of meat. And we've converted the meat consumption thing into beef to try and make it easier to measure. So if you eat meat, what's carbon footprint? Is that really big? Quite a lot of people. Really small? No one saying small? Medium or frightened to? Okay, somebody thinks it's really big. So, okay, let me release the balloon that corresponds with meat, which, if I get it right, is this one. By the way, there's no significance whatsoever to the colour of the balloons, in case anybody thinks they're being really clever. It's just that's the colour that comes in the bag. So, you compare the height of the balloon that corresponds with meat consumption with tumble drying, and actually, that's really quite significant. And that's why, as you will know, there is so much focus now on meat consumption and it being one of the good things that, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint as a citizen, it's one of the biggest things you can do in terms of reducing your own personal carbon footprint. Why do we think, by the way, that meat consumption has a big carbon footprint? Why?
Is it to do with because it has very
Yeah, both of those things. So, yeah, there's carbon consumption in terms of the fertiliser that's used to go on the fields that feeds the cattle often and the feed that they're produced. And meat has to be refrigerated, so you've got to use energy all the time to keep it cold as it's transported through the chain. Obviously, people are aware of the methane issue with cattle, we'll call it. So that's also an issue. If you use the same piece of land to kind of feed animals, beef cows, and then eat them, and instead use the same amount of land to grow vegetables and eat a plant-based diet, it's about a 10-to-1 ratio. So you can support 10 people on the same amount of land that you can support one person if the person has a meat-based diet. So it's a really big issue. Flying. A return flight to the Bahamas, from Manchester Airport to the Bahamas, economy class for one person, so the footprint of one individual doing that. All of those details are quite important. So, what do we think? Flying. High? Almost everybody. Low? Medium? Few people saying medium there. So that's interesting, because flying is one of those things that does attract an awful lot of attention. And let me get the right clip, which is that one. I could really have used easier clips, couldn't I? There you go. So that's why flying gets so much attention, because it has a big carbon footprint. So there's a lot of focus on meat. But that's a diet of a meat for a year, which is a big carbon footprint. One flight for one person, economy, there and back, dwarfs the footprint of meat consumption. And that's why there's so much focus on flying. It's partly because, to keep a large chunk of metal in the air and throw it across the world as far as the Bahamas takes an enormous amount of energy. The emissions from the plane released at high altitude have a thing called radiative forcing. They are more effective in warming than if the same emissions occur at sea level, by about, I think it's twice as much. So flying has a huge carbon footprint. So again, as a personal individual, if you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint, flying less, planning your journeys if you are going to fly to not hop over to Frankfurt and on to somewhere else, doing it in a single flight, because most of the emissions are on takeoff and on landing, are all things that you can do. But flying does have a really big carbon footprint, and there's no getting around it. Driving a typical small petrol car for a year for 7,800 miles with one occupant. And if you really wanted me to, I could tell you exactly what type of car it was. It's a small Honda, I seem to remember. But specifically petrol. What do we think? Driving, again, it's something that has an environmental impact. We know that. Who thinks that's a really big impact? Ooh, people have been quite guarded now. Small. No one thinks it's small. Medium. Quite a lot of people think it's a medium. Okay. Yeah, so medium was about right. So is driving a good thing in terms of carbon? Well, no, it has a carbon footprint. But actually, when you compare it with things like tumble drying, so your tumble drying is what, about a third of that, of driving that distance? But you compare it with a flight and you think, driving for 7,800 miles a year in a car is only the equivalent of half of a single flight, which is one of the reasons why flying is always focused on so much. Okay, last one. A medium-sized dog. Imagine you have a medium-sized dog. Because you're all sat so far away, I didn't use these. I normally use cards, but there's a picture of a really cute little puppy, but he's going to grow into a medium-sized dog, I promise. So, diet for a medium-sized dog for a year. What do we think? Who thinks it's really big? Quite a lot of people. Who thinks it's small? No one? Who thinks it's medium? Oh, a few dog lovers all going for medium with their fingers desperately crossed. Go on. I haven't got enough helium in the balloon. The balloons are leaking helium slightly because it's such a warm room, but keep going. Okay, so the answer is it's significantly worse than the flight. The dog is by far the worst of the lot. And in fact, it's so big, I've had to put so much string on it, it's dragging the balloon back down again. When I tested it, it worked okay. But it's enormous. I calibrated that. It goes all the way to the ceiling. So why is the carbon footprint of a dog so bad? What do you think? Yeah? Yep. It could be. So if we fed it a different kind of meat, because different kind of meats have different carbon footprints, so lamb has a significantly lower carbon footprint, chicken much lower, fish really quite low in comparison. So feeding it on basically a beef-based diet means it is particularly high. But we actually missed out a load of the diet because most dogs eat cereal product as part of their dog food. Most eat 95 kilos of cereal product a year, and we couldn't easily carbon footprint that bit, so we skipped that bit entirely. So in fact, the carbon footprint is even worse than the thing I've shown you already, if it's a mainly kind of red meat-based diet. And it eliminates all the stuff we do with dogs, like putting them in the car to drive them to the park to run around a bit and then drive them back home, and all the trips to the vet and all that kind of stuff. So what it shows is that actually having a dog, because of all of the ramifications of that, the carbon footprint is really enormous. So the reason we do this isn't because I don't love dogs, because I think dogs are lovely. And I'm not suggesting, as a previous person who viewed this game suggested that we should eat the dog, because that was the best way to kind of offset in some weird kind of a way. What I'm demonstrating is that actually trying to work out the carbon footprints of things is actually quite complicated, and instinctively, even though we as an audience are actually quite informed, even we are quite surprised by some of the things that don't matter much, and some of the things that matter a disproportionately large amount. So what is carbon literacy? That's what we mean by carbon literacy. That's the definition. Carbon Literacy Project is a registered charity, and it was put together, and that definition was put together by a panel of 30 people and organisations who came together to say, how could we roll out a day's worth of learning about climate change that would work with everybody? So citizens, organisations, people in school and university, people in the public sector, people in the private sector. So we had people from all these different audiences came together and said, how could we design a day that would work? And they came up with a formula that has consistent science for everybody, but then has space so it's adapted for every audience. And every audience designs its own bit of training and helps in the delivery to itself with people like the people who are learning. So it's a very democratic way of doing it. But carbon literacy has awareness built into it, and it's about the everyday things that we do. And it's about having ability and motivation, because it has to be a day's worth of learning that makes people fired up and think, I can do something, not, oh my God, we're doomed. To reduce emissions individually, as part of the communities that we belong to, and as part of the organisations. So a big stream of this is working in the workplace, and that's about people in the workplace not turning off the lights and printing slightly less, but looking at what that workplace does and then thinking, what do I do in my workplace? How can I affect the products we sell, the ways we relate to suppliers, the things we do or don't do? So the reason we're talking about this is because Leeds as a city and the Climate Commission has made a commitment to carbon literacy and wants to roll carbon literacy out as part of the process and the conversation within the city to engage more people in doing a day's worth of learning and being more informed and empowered to do more to address the climate emergency. If you do a day's worth of carbon literacy, you submit some evidence, which comes back to us as a project, we assess it, and if you pass, you get a certificate to say that you are carbon literate. And people are now using this as part of their nice thing to put on the wall, but part of their employment portfolio to say, I get this, I can join another company or an organisation and say, I know how to deal with the climate emergency. Just to put the project into numbers, so you know what we've done so far. So just over 10,000 citizens have gone through this day's worth of learning and been certified as carbon literate. I'm going to stand over here because I realise I'm stood in front of the projector all the time, sorry. As part of your carbon literacy, you pledge to an action. So you take an action as an individual that's within your control, and you take an action with a larger group of people, whoever that is that you can affect. So because you do that, more than 20,000 actions have been written out, pledged, and we would expect to have been carried out. That's actually a gross underestimate, because most people submit 4 or 5 actions. Very rarely are there just 2. So in fact, the number will be much higher than that. We have 31 organisations who've embedded carbon literacy in their culture, and there's a much more difficult qualification that an organisation can take to show that they are carbon literate and dealing with the emergency. There's a professional training process for people who want to train others, although it's not obligatory. Anyone can train anybody else in carbon literacy with a copy of the standard and access to the internet. And over 440 organisations have at least one person that's done their carbon literacy training and are therefore engaged with the product. We're engaged with 8 different nations. We keep changing these numbers, which is why I keep having to turn around, because I'm not quite sure how the numbers have changed since the last time I looked at the slide. We set up consortia of organisations. So it was interesting, we heard from Yorkshire Water. I'm working at the moment on trying to set up a consortium of water organisations across the UK working together on carbon. And we've just been funded by the UK government from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to work with the public sector, meaning National Health Service, local authorities, universities, blue light emergency services, and a government department, working with them as 5 separate audiences to help them develop their carbon literacy materials for national rollout, funded by national government. So I think that's a first for government. In my experience working for green NGOs, I've never known them give us any money like that before. There are more than 64 courses that people have authorised and qualified to teach carbon literacy to others. And we know from studies done by some of the organisations that work with this, one in particular, Jacobs Construction, they estimate that their staff who become carbon literate reduce their resource and carbon footprint by between 5 and 15%, which is why organisations are interested in doing it. So, if you want to know more, you can find out from us directly. That's our website. It's carbonliteracy.com. So you can go there and find out whatever you want to as an individual. But there will be organisations here in Leeds that you interact with, whether it's the council or the university or private sector organisations, and hopefully many more, that will be engaging in carbon literacy. So go back to your organisations, whatever they are, whatever organisations you're involved with, churches, places of study, sports clubs or wherever, and ask them, are they yet doing their carbon literacy? And if not, why not? But I've got a few minutes left. I think I've got 5 minutes, I think. Has anyone got any questions? Sure, go. So have we done work with schools? We have. We split our audiences into people who live, work and study. It reflects the origins of the original project, because that was the audiences that we were aiming at. And because we're quite a small charity, we've had to target what we thought were the lower hanging fruit first. So we did some early work with schools and then discovered it was really difficult to engage with them, mainly because the schools had a lack of funding to engage with us in terms of literally getting teachers out of the classroom to talk to us. So we backed off for a little while and are now starting to re-engage again. But we have primary school training materials that a school can just implement, already checked against the national curriculum. We have some secondary school get a better job by being carbon literate materials. We've done quite a lot of work in Scotland with the Scottish Government. There's a pilot that's just nearing completion with 200 teachers and pupils who've done carbon literacy training with a standard set of materials produced by the National Sustainability Charity for Scotland. And the idea is that those 200 are not doing them in their schools, they're going back to their schools, teachers and pupils from a school, to then try and roll it out within the school and see how far they go. I'm trying to think, is there anything else? We're also doing, in the early stages, of potentially partnering with a company called Solar for Schools, who do exactly what it says on the tin. They put solar panels on schools to save the schools money, but they use some of the profits that they as a company get from that relationship to go back in and help the school teach climate change, and they're interested in partnering up with us directly. So that doesn't feel oddly like very much, because we've got 9 or 10 schools that have gone through carbon literacy. And it's an audience that, of all of our audiences, we've probably neglected a bit. But we hope to be able to do more as we add more capacity. And if you're involved in a school, give us a shout. We're always interested in working with you. What other questions have we got? Yep.
What are the resistances you experience, and how do you ameliorate them?
Yeah, so resistances probably vary a little bit by audience. So we've talked about schools, and it's just haven't got time or money, that kind of resistance. Within large organisations, it's the fact they are large organisations. It takes ages to get them to do anything. So we'll talk to them literally sometimes for years to get them through their decision-making process, to put together a paper, to go to their board, to be considered, and it's just incredibly slow. Those would probably be the 2 key ones. In universities, actually the take-up has been good when we've approached universities. Universities are quite complex ecosystems of students and academic staff and non-academic professional staff. But we've made quite good progress with universities. But mainly I think it's kind of bandwidth would be the thing I'd say for all audiences. Everybody these days is busy, and for budgetary reasons, no one seems to be wallowing around in loads of cash. And there is a cost to training your people to deliver anything new, much less climate change. So it's that trying to get the airtime and trying to get the bandwidth from the organisation. The declarations of climate emergencies has made a real difference to us. Whereas we used to go out and try and engage with organisations, literally the phone rings in the office almost every day with a new large organisation, often a council, coming in saying, we've declared a climate emergency. To be honest, we don't know what the hell we're doing. What do we do? We know you've worked with local authorities. So I would hope that bandwidth is getting wider, because obviously we need it to as fast as possible. Probably got time for one more. Kate. Yeah.
Actually, I think we might
Okay. Yep. Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found something there interesting and I wasn't preaching to the already converted things you already knew. But I hope you found it interesting and I look forward to speaking to you at some point in the future. Thanks very much.
you want to switch me on? Gents, would you like to sit down so we can start the second half of this evening? Third half of this evening, third part of this evening. Don't leave me to do the numbers, I would say. Thanks ever so much for, I hope you've had did you enjoy the breakout sessions? Were they useful, helpful in any way? Useful and helpful. Good, good, good. Now, this is what has been called the super panel. And what we have is, I don't know how many people go to a lot of events, and I imagine there's quite a lot of people here who go to a lot of events, especially about climate. Lots of people, very expert at the front. We've got 4 people who talk for a long time, and then 2 or 3 of you get to ask a question, then they talk for a long time again, and then you all go home. We're not doing it like that, because we want to have more people. This is a conversation, so we'll have more experts who are talking for less time, and you guys have already had the opportunity to put some questions in, and we'll have some opportunities to be able to do some follow-up questions as well. Now, the key thing about this, and this is a difficult thing, I do a lot of these things with politicians and political people, and somebody very wise, also a political person, interesting combination, but anyway, sorry, Lisa. I'm just being cheeky for the sake of it, really, said, the thing about politics is that everything might have been said, but not everybody who wants to say it has yet said it, right? Now, we've only got till 9 o'clock, and there's a lot of you, and there's a lot of expertise, so I am recommending that if you simply want to agree with somebody who has already said something, you don't say it, and think of something new and fresh and interesting and short to say instead. Does that sound like a deal? Right? Are you all up for that? Because I know this is a conversation that's going on till October, so we won't say everything tonight. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do, we've got until 8:30, okay? So that basically, we've got some questions that have already been tabled. I'm going to pick those out and get those people to stand up and ask the question, and I'm going to suggest some people from the super panel to answer those questions. But next, you need to know who's on the super panel. So, I'm going to call out their name, and they're going to stand up and wave so that you can see them. Some of them you will already have met, but I want you to know who they are, okay? So, Professor Andy Goulson, Chair of the Leeds Climate Commission. Stand up, Andy. Honestly. That's better. Great. Councillor Lisa Mulheron, Executive Member for Climate Change, Transport and Sustainable Development at Leeds Council. Polly Cook, who is Chief Officer, Sustainable Energy and Air Quality at Leeds City Council. Neil Evans, Director of Resources and Housing, Leeds City Council. Great. Bill Adams, Regional Secretary, TUC, Yorkshire and Humber. Right, we've got them all here. Right, and who else have we got? Rizwan Navaz, we've met Rizwan, and he's from the Medina Town Movement, which we've heard about already. Matt Carmichael, secondary teacher at Roundhay School, Leeds. Fantastic, Matt. Thanks for coming. Karen Stefekis, the Development Manager at Commercial Estates Group. Hello, Karen. Alexis Percival, who is Environmental and Sustainability Manager at Yorkshire Ambulance Services NHS Trust. Nice to see you, Alexis. Mark Goldstone, Head of Policy, West and North Yorkshire Chamber of Commerce. Great. See what I mean about super panel? Bishop Paul Slater. Where's the bishop? There. We can spot the bishop. You can always spot the bishop, unless you're in mufti. Right, that's the Diocese of Leeds, Church of England. Shannon Jackson, University of Leeds Master Students and Youth Strike Organiser. Hello, Shannon. Brilliant to see you here. And Helen Hart, representing, hello, Helen, our future Leeds. And that was, we heard from them a little bit recently. Okay, great. Oh, we've got one more. Oh, Josh Render. Sorry, I've got Extinction Rebellion speaker TBC, and I didn't know that we've got a name for them. Josh. Hello, Josh. I hope your activities have been successful yesterday, today, and for the rest of the week. Great. We'll want to hear more from you. Right. So I've got some questions. First question, would you believe that I chose? I thought this is a really good question. Unfortunately, Kerry Harker, who posed it and presented it in, can't be here, but I'm going to ask it first because I think it's a good way of us kicking off this conversation. How does this become the genuinely whole city conversation that it needs to be? Now, I'm going to start that with Bill. Bill, could you, we've got a microphone for Bill. Just quickly, what do you think we need to do to make sure that this involves everybody, not just the people in this room? And do you want to stand up so people can see you?
Well, it is an all-city thing because climate change affects everyone. It's not just workers, who I represent, of which there are 640,000 across the region, not just in Leeds. But it affects us all. But we actually make it a city issue by having proper social dialogue, groups like this, inroads into the council, councillors listening to us, but also our MPs and government listening, because this isn't only about Leeds. We're going to require everyone to invest in a future of zero carbon, and that's going to take lots of money, lots of commitment, not just from local government, but from central government too.
And lots of change for your members. Yeah, absolutely. Can I also ask Shannon, what do you think we're going to be able to do to be able to make it a whole city conversation? No, don't shout. There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
no, so I guess the thing that I wanted to say was that I think we need to start talking about climate in a way which, like groups like XR have done, where it feels immediate and it feels like it's we need to act now. So, for example, the council has put the active transport strategy under the public health department, which I think is really good. But I think we need to engage in issues that affect communities that aren't here. So if we look at who's here right now, it's a very white audience. And I think that's coming from both the grassroots and from top down in Leeds. And so we need to start having conversations that matter to these communities and bridging the gap between kind of everyone that is engaged now and people who aren't.
That's great. Can you just pass the microphone to Helen? Well done. Helen, Shannon set a really good challenge on that. So what would be the things that would give that conversation meaning for people who aren't here, who haven't spent a lovely Leeds evening in a lecture theatre talking about the end of the world?
I think it's really a case of get out of the lecture theatre and get out there and talk to people. We got a phone call, a message through from Ed Carlisle saying we've got the Beeston Festival on. Can someone come and talk about climate? Just pick up some leaflets and go and talk, and you'd be surprised. There's a lot more people on side since we've had all this David Attenborough and everything. So actually talk to people about it.
Great.
And when you're on the bus and you hear someone grumbling about the detour because there was awful Extinction Rebellion people blocking, just say, well, we've got the council sort of on side, but we need the government on side, so we've still got to push. Just talk to people. It's as simple as that, instead of talking about it. If anyone wants to come to this, there's actually an outreach session, and we're having a pre-planning session where we want people from other communities to come and join us. Talk to me later about it.
Great, that's fantastic. Can you pass that to Rizwan? Rizwan, what would you say? Because I mean, I'm not being funny, but people have pointed out this is a very white audience. You are a rarity. Can you explain what we need to do to change that?
I think you need to talk to people. You need to connect with them. You need to find points, ways of how to sort of connect with them. And this is why I sort of come from a faith perspective. So in terms of the Muslim community in Britain, I've just looked at the figures. Let's say Leeds Greater City Region, Leeds City Region, about 3 million. People, say 3 to 5% Muslim community. That's what, 90, 100,000 people in this region. There's about 40 plus mosques in the region. We've already engaged with some of them and tried to get faith leaders to educate people, raise awareness. But the key thing, and this is sort of for the long term, getting people to change their mindsets in the long term, is actually it's relating that, and I guess it's true for all faiths, it's relating this issue to scripture. And of the scriptures that I've looked at, the Quran in particular has a lot of references to nature. And on the basis of that, we've actually, not me, but not this organization, but there is an Islamic declaration on global climate change. I guess most of the Muslim community are not aware of this. So it's getting these messages across to say why this is important, and statements in here where you can actually talk to people on their sort of at a level where they can understand. So I think that's a key thing.
That's fantastic. Right, I'm going to go to, thank you so much, Rizwan. Now, Jafim Vogel. Is Jafim Vogel in the room? Have I pronounced your name right? I'm really sorry if I haven't. Brilliant. You've got a question.
I have. It's kind of been raised, so I'm going to play to your rules and slightly change the question, if that's okay, in the interest of not repeating. So I'm wondering, how far are we willing to go here? I'm really glad to see this willingness for change, but it sounds to me like it's kind of easy and doable, but we know that there's really difficult challenges ahead, and some of them haven't been mentioned. Consumption was sort of it's not really in there. That's more than double the emissions from within the city come from consumption. What about the airport? The airport is being expanded while we're declaring a climate emergency. How is that, how does that square? So can we start talking about the difficult things now, not in 10 years? And can we start talking about how the needs of the people are being addressed?
That's fantastic. We have got another question on aviation, which I don't want to miss. So can we focus on that issue that you've raised, Jafim, about making sure that everybody is involved in that, and that we are making sure that some of the tough choices are clear in what the Leeds Climate Commission is going to recommend? So this one's actually to you, Andy, because how will those transformations to a zero carbon Leeds? I mean, a lot of people are just thinking, I've got to get the kids to school, I've got to get to work, I've got to get food on the table, I've got to make sure that the bank balance adds up. That feels like a lot of pressure. And then you tell everybody they've got to do something really difficult, they're going to say, I'm going to leave that till later.
So I think there are two aspects to that. One is that climate change can't stay in a silo. It needs to be kind of mainstreamed into housing and energy and transport and all the other areas that really affect the quality of people's lives. And that will reach out into other areas maybe that are less concerned about climate. The second is that I think we need to see climate as a way of helping us to become the city that we want to become in a broader sense, not only about climate change. And that means, equity and inclusion, and it needs kind of resilience and vibrancy and all of the other elements. And so we need to see this as a kind of catalyst for broader change rather than a little silo that is just going to be involved with energy efficiency and low carbon and, stuff like that.
But Jafim points out that thing about consumption. I mean, the reality is we've exported a lot of our emissions, haven't we? And then we bring them back in the form of cheap clothes and iPhones.
Yeah, I mean, some of us were at a Yorkshire Water Conference earlier and talking about this kind of thing, and someone said, what's the most radical thing you can think of? To me, the most radical thing I can think of is for middle class and more affluent people, high consumers, to realise that more consumption doesn't make you happier. And the value shift that would come from that to say, invest in time, invest in quality of life, don't invest in, accumulation of more and more stuff.
Note to self, less stuff. Does that mean I've got something else to do on a Saturday afternoon rather than shopping? Okay, noted. Right. Now, Steph Robinson was going to ask a question. Steph, can we get a microphone to Steph? Go on. Yes. I think. Do you want to shout?
It's working.
Great.
My question is, what's Leeds Council doing to demand more resources from central government to deal with the climate crisis?
Well, the big national policy gap. Councillor Mulheron, there is so much we can do here in Leeds, but ultimately there's quite a lot of stuff that you don't have the powers and resources to do. So how do we get them to change their minds?
So there's a whole raft of things we're asking central government for. First of all, to actually give us the power to actually run our own public transport, to have... So one of the things we've asked for devolution is actually to enable West Yorkshire and the City region to be able to control affordability and reliability of public transport, to be able to design routes, to know where those buses are going to be going and to be able to serve all of our communities. Currently, we don't have that. We also need to have the power from central government to be able to ensure that volume house builders have to build houses that actually meet the sort of design guidelines that we'd like them to have to be the most energy efficient. And to require them to actually ensure that we have new housing that is designed to ensure people can walk, cycle and use public transport. So when we have new housing that's built, we don't actually have the powers to make a new health centre be built alongside it. Wouldn't that be great, actually, so people can actually walk to the doctors rather than have to jump in a car and drive or get a bus? In my area, people are having to get a bus. It takes a 2-hour round trip for a person who's not able to get in a car to go to the GPs and back again. That's not acceptable. That's not actually going to encourage people to walk and cycle and use public transport.
Great.
There's a whole load of other stuff, but I'm conscious that I'm probably speaking too long.
Thank you very much.
For the final thing, actually,
one more thing.
one final thing, sorry. Well, I've got the microphone very, very quickly. Public services, actually, to be able to invest, we need central government to recognise that local communities and local councils need that investment. We've seen our budgets slashed over the last 10 years, and actually to have more resources in local areas to be able to invest in all of these things that we want to see, we need to see that stop and be reversed, and for the 66% of our government grants that have gone in the last 10 years to come back so we can actually put that money into our local communities.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mulherry. Now, what you also need to know, just to by the by, is that one of the Leeds MPs, Rachel Reeves, is convening via her role in Parliament a National Climate Emergency Citizens Assembly, and we need to make sure that the voices here get there so that they can set up a whole set of recommendations to national government. So the things that Councillor Mulherry has talked about is not just her saying it, but it's loads more people too, including the citizens. That's exactly what we want to do as part of the conversation, is to make sure that those really clear asks are part of that. So we've got one specifically. Adam Harper. Adam, this goes on from what Councillor Mulherry was saying about building standards.
Hello. I suppose my questions now become more of a challenge to the council, given what the council just said. So the Minister for Housing back in the autumn basically clarified that councils can now set their own energy requirements for new housing when they grant planning permission. So my challenge to the council is, why do you not now go ahead and ask for passive house for all brand new build housing? Because the government is now saying that councils can once again set their own energy standards.
Okay. Now, the great thing about these kind of audiences is that most people seem to know what passive house is, but just for the people who don't, it's like super, super, super high energy efficiency, which means that you don't actually need to have any heating broadly. Would that be fair?
Yeah, yes, probably.
Yeah. So Neil is going to explain.
So two-part answer to this. So it's true we have some flexibility, but in fact, a revised clarification came out in March of this year, which if I will read out, actually. Local authorities can set energy performance standards for new housing or the adaptation of buildings to provide dwellings that are higher than the building regulations, but only up to equivalent of level 4 for the Code for Sustainable Homes. And that's paragraph 012 reference, so and so. So actually that is the true position, that actually we aren't able to do passive house as a part of the planning policy. What we are able to go is around about 20% higher than the building regulations, which is actually already one of our policies which we are moving on. But I'll be a bit more direct than that and say, well, if the government took it away, would we do passive house? And I think I'll be blunt, I think at the moment we probably would say not, because actually I think the industry is not mature enough at the moment to kind of give us a position where you're really getting value around what you're trying to do. So you're chasing perfection, and it's costing you a hell of a lot of money to just squeeze out that final few percent. So at the moment we are building we've built 1,000 council homes. We're trying to build more. We've really tried to sort of squeeze it out on a few of our projects, and it's ending up costing us a fortune just to get that extra bit. And we're trying to do that in the context of 100 people bidding for every council house that we let, 1,600 people going for 20 council houses which we built. And actually, money is important. So we really want the highest standards. But I think until there's a time when we get things like off-site manufacture, which gives us passive house in a way which that extra few percent isn't costing us a fortune, we can't really go with it as a policy.
Okay, thank you, Neil. I think what's also interesting is that them taking away something is different from them putting the regulation in. So if they'd said, set the bar higher to everybody, everybody would have to do it, and that might indeed send this message to the market that you would get the standards and the quality at a price that you can afford. But you don't have that. They just, oh yeah, no, do what you like, which is not quite the same as do the best you can. Do you see what I mean? So sometimes government says one thing and does another. What a surprise. Right, so Mark Sturgeon. Mark, you've got a good question. Who's got a microphone for him?
We're good. Hello. Yeah, so I think everyone who's sat here will be encouraged by what's been happening over the last few months. There's been a real sea change of attitude. A lot of things happening in policy, and that's fantastic. However, on my daily existence, I talk to a lot of people, and I still find a lot of people, especially at my work, couldn't care less about climate change. And just a conversation in the canteen or the coffee room, the amount of frivolous flying and driving that I hear about on a daily basis is sickening, to be honest. And the question is, how do you think we can get the serious message across to the people who just do not care when they're being effectively told by the government and given carte blanche to carry on as they are with the way that they travel and holiday? We spoke about consumption, we spoke about food. Mainly travel and holidays, the construction of Heathrow, mixed messages. They're just going to use that as an excuse to carry on as they are.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Bishop, if it's really tough, ask the bishop.
Thank you. I mean, Rizwan has already talked about the faith communities having traction in local communities, and you know, all the major faiths, if you look at their scriptures, there's real encouragement for caring for the earth in there. And we've already started in Leeds getting together all the faith leaders for a taster on carbon conversations. And what we want to do is to actually roll out carbon conversations across the city. You know, and I'd like to just see hundreds and hundreds of banners outside faith buildings saying carbon conversations here, come and talk about this. Now, you know, I can see that some people are just going to ignore that. So I think workplaces are, again, places where we can actually start to engage with people who hitherto have not given this a thought, really.
Great. Well, I was going to ask about the godless, and funnily enough, the reason why I was going to ask about the godless, I was going to ask Alexis, not her making any observation about your position whatsoever, but as a businesswoman, can you explain?
Can I just say,
yeah,
I mean, we expect that faith communities to actually reach out into their local communities and encourage anybody to come, faith or no faith, to do carbon conversations with us. So it's not just for the people of faith, it's for everybody.
Great. Okay, Alexis.
So I'm a sustainability manager by trade, and I have these conversations on a daily basis. They're a nightmare. And I completely understand everybody sitting in this room going, how do I communicate with somebody who just loves to jet off to the Bahamas every summer and say, why don't you think about maybe going on a train journey to Europe, and them just going, well, I just need to be on a sunny beach. It's maybe something that we've missed in part of our conversation is the carbon intensity of everything in our life. So we were having a conversation earlier at the Yorkshire Water event, which was about, do you know about how a banana would fare versus a strawberry? And a strawberry that is grown in a very intense, heated greenhouse would be more carbon intensive than something that's come on a slow boat from the Caribbean. And if we don't have that conversation with somebody about actually getting on an aeroplane will cost you your your carbon footprint for the year, nobody knows. So maybe we need to start with that conversation with transport networks, with food suppliers, with sitting in an office and going, oh, it's like looking at a calorie counter on the back of a packet of strawberries, or looking at the back of your rail ticket and going, do you know, this has cost me this much carbon to have this. If I went and ate lentils rather than a strawberry that's come from a greenhouse, I actually would have saved my carbon. And if we all had a carbon budget and said in our own head, we're going to limit ourselves this year to 11 tonnes, and next year we're going to be 10 tonnes, but we're not going to fly, so we're actually getting down to 7 tonnes, you can have those conversations and you can have the challenges, you can have the communication.
That's great, thank you so much. Mark, can I ask you to follow up on that? Because Mark's from the Chamber of Commerce, so you're dealing with a lot of small businesses who have got, they're looking at the bottom line. How does it work for them?
Thank you for that question, by the way. Where do I start? We've heard, I don't want to go over old ground, but I think it's important just to reiterate this. We saw and heard earlier about behavioural change. And I remember growing up in the 70s and nobody wore a seatbelt. Now you wouldn't think of doing it. I remember all of the incremental changes that have happened because it's just become simply unacceptable in society. And I think that's perhaps an approach, and I'll give you a very good example, quick audience participation. Who has children? Leave your hands up, I haven't finished yet. How many of them have been how many of you have been pestered, rightly so, having watched the plastic programme with Hugh Fearnley-Whittinstall? I can't go to sleep at night without being told I don't take my children to supermarkets anymore. That's the pester power of children. And I don't want to trivialise what is a really, really important issue, but I think behavioural change is happening. It's happening. You know, you're all in this room because we want things to change. You know, how many of you would have been in this room 5 years ago?
How do you, I'm just going to do a quick follow-up on that, though, because the fact of the matter is small businesses haven't got big sustainable procurement strategies. They're just worrying about, have they got something that will work in their business? And how can they be confident that the stuff that they are buying in order for their business to work is sustainable?
Why don't we tell them? I agree with the last part. I think it's absolutely, you know, the warnings on food packaging has had a real impact. But I think just to come back to defending small businesses, you'd be incredibly surprised how many of them do care about this agenda, actually. We run an initiative called Raising the Bar, and one of the categories that people can measure themselves on is how environmentally, how environmental they are. And what we find is this isn't just about them as businesses wanting to do the right thing. This is actually being able to tell others how they're doing the right thing and their social impact. And it has all sorts of other implications. And I'll give you an example is young people in particular are making employment choices based on, does this company share my values? They are doing it. It's not just about salary anymore or location. And I think that's a really good thing. So actually, how do we, as the business community, how do we articulate what our values are? And as I say, there are other tools out there, but we've got one that's free to use on our website. So.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. Right, I've got another one. This one is about the economy. Linda Pearson. Linda. Great, can we get a mic to Linda?
Hi. Focusing on regenerating the economy in the north of England, how do we move perceptions about CO2 emissions as to being an opportunity rather than a threat?
Opportunity, not a threat. That feels very different from the rest of the conversation we've had, has been about the seriousness of the science. But there is an opportunity here, isn't there? So who have we got that was going to talk about that? Bill, were you happy to talk about that bit?
Thanks for the question. Really important one, I think, because currently across the region, I can't talk for Leeds, but across the region, we have something in the region of 30,000 direct jobs. People who work in energy, glass production, chemicals, steel, food and beverage manufacture. Those jobs are already at risk from the Paris Climate Agreement. And if companies and organisations don't put in changes, then people will be losing their jobs. My view is that technology and science will greatly affect what happens in the next 10 years. Because there are different processes for using energy, for example. It's probably going to take more time than we've got to bring out a completely renewable system. Therefore, science has to get us over the period where we can still burn fossil fuels but capture them and store them under the sea for a limited period. Otherwise, people are going to lose their jobs. And people who work in these industries, and people who work in industries right across, are going to be affected. They've had 40 years of being excluded from the debate. And so what we're trying to do, and we're working with Andy and Leeds University and the councils and the local enterprise partnerships, we're trying to create a system of social dialogue, which is very evident in places like Germany, where we have a complete shutdown of coal and nuclear production in the next few years. But we have to think about the people that work there and their livelihoods. And so we need to be talking to government, we need to be talking to authorities and employers. And I think one of the things that will has to change is the constant upscaling of the need for profit. We're all going to have to change that. Workers are going to have to accept that they can't always have higher pay. People, consumers, are also going to accept that they may need to cut back, but science and technology will cushion that blow if we have the right investment. And that's going to take all of us working together and people not working at, say, Drax power station where they're going to work on a Monday and on a Tuesday morning they get a text message saying, I'm sorry, we're closing down. It's got to be brought about by social debate. That's got to include unions and it's got to include communities.
Thank you so much, Bill. Brilliant. And I'd also like to, just while we're on that point, I'd also like to bring in Karen. Could you have, I know because you'll have some views on this as well.
Hi, so I work in the built environment, the development sector, and we know that buildings are responsible for around somewhere between 35 and 40% of carbon emissions in the UK. So a significant part of this conversation and part of the problem, but hopefully also part of the solution. We've already discussed slightly in terms of passive house and fabric efficiency, and I think in terms of opportunities specifically around manufacturing, that part of the question. We are seeing a shift, I think, towards off-site manufacture to deliver more efficient housing, more efficient buildings, and I think that will, it is the way forward. The science is there in terms of producing buildings which need less energy to run efficiently. I think that will have a big part to play in terms of regenerating the manufacturing sector in the north. I think also in terms of looking at the opportunities, we have to, all of us in this room are on the same page already, but the conversations which need to go wider, we need to be recognising the opportunities within the market and from the development sector. I think this is from two directions. This is the shift from institutional funds, big pension funds that are pumping money into development. They are now, I think, resisting putting money into buildings which are going to be obsolete within the next 10 years. So I think that in itself is an opportunity. The other opportunity coming from those of us who choose our homes, choose our offices and decide where to live and work, I think that's the other big change. And trying to be positive and looking to some case studies where this has worked. I think that Australia, quite far away, but has got quite a success in this area, particularly in terms of the commercial office market. I think we're not too dissimilar in terms of economies. And within the last 10 years, they have halved the operational energy from their commercial building stock through publication of a badge scheme, really, but actually being transparent, talking about energy in real pounds and pence and having a badge at the foyer of your building so that it becomes part of our choice as consumers to decide which buildings we want to live and work in. So I think that's also part of the opportunities.
That's really great. It sounds like we start to get a conversation which might punch outside of the sort of climate bubble, because we're talking about jobs, we're talking about skills, we're talking about safer, warmer, healthier homes, and the kind of things that people will kind of go, yeah, no, I'd like a bit of that. Okay, now I've got Nick Hodgkinson. Nick, you've got a question that Nick's here. I'm asking his question for him because of Nick's disability, because he can't speak, so I'm asking the question for you. Why have emissions from aviation been excluded from the roadmap, particularly in light of the proposal to more than double the number of passengers flying from Leeds Bradford Airport by 2050. I was just in that carbon literacy game show earlier, and I'm not going to the Caribbean by plane ever. So, Andy, can you just explain to us how we're going to get around this one, or how we're going to solve it?
Thanks.
No pressure.
Clearly, it's an omission. I mean, it's there because, or it's not there because when cities and towns talk about their carbon footprints, most of the time they're talking about their territorial emissions, and long-distance travel is normally excluded from them. But we recognise it's a gap, and the Leeds Climate Commission will be working on a position paper and developing the evidence base and injecting that evidence into the conversation here in Leeds. And it's critical, obviously it's critical. And broader consumption issues, there in the carbon roadmap, there are some consumption-based aspects that say, okay, Leeds can do things in our town, city, like reducing meat and dairy consumption or reducing steel and concrete consumption, which would give us an impact outside of our city. And if we want to take the credit for some of the good things we do on consumption outside of the city, then we need to take the blame for some of the bad things we do on consumption outside of the city, and prime amongst those is aviation, absolutely. However, I honestly don't know how, I mean, Jeff and I do know because we worked a little bit on a position paper or the beginnings of that for the last commission, and we have committed to developing that and publishing that and making sure that that's a key part of the debate. And as a minimum, whatever decisions are taken from here on in will be taken in the context of complete transparency and accountability. And I'm not sure that's always there at the moment, especially on aviation, where it's a massively contentious topic and we need some neutral evidence to guide the way that we approach that. I will say, I think when you look at that as a question, I think when we were talking about 80% carbon cuts by 2050, we had a little bit of wiggle room, and aviation was a big part of that wiggle room. Now we're talking about net zero. I think that raises the game very, very substantially for what would have been the residual carbon emissions, aviation in particular. And you know, it's a good thing that this is coming forward in the city now, because the sooner we grapple with it, the better, right? So.
Great, Shannon. Have you got some thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think when I got this question, why is it excluded, I have absolutely no idea. The only thing I could say is that I think it poses those hard questions, and I think it's a bit of a political topic, and so it was omitted to maybe start the ball rolling on actions that were less contentious. At the minute, in terms of we're talking about jobs, like I think the council could be doing more, and I recognise the council is doing a lot, and I'm not anti-council in any way, but I think on this issue in particular, I don't understand why the council is, I know they don't have control over the airport and its expansion, but they have actively endorsed it as part of their growth strategy, and I don't understand why they are not engaging with the people that work at the airport right now to say, you know, how are we going to transition you into a different area of the economy? Because what we need to think about in relation to things like the airport and the growth that we're aiming for is we're not thinking about what is okay and compatible now. We need to think about what areas of our economy are not compatible by 2030, by 2040, by 2050. And the airport is not one of them. And we need to start thinking in that term and working back. And at the minute, we're not doing that with the airport. And it's not just an omission, it's an unwillingness to engage in a very, very hard conversation. But I think the council could be doing more.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Now, the reason they asked me to do this is because I'm really good at keeping to time, and now I'm going to break my own reputation because we've got 3 minutes and I've got 4 questions, which... Oh! Kate's being really nice to me. She's given me given me some more time, so therefore we will be able to get all the questions in, and I will be able to keep my reputation. Excellent. So Jonathan, pitches. You've got a question. Where's Jonathan? He's right at the back there.
Thank you. How do we continue to motivate ourselves at a personal level when the big international players such as China and the USA appear to show no interest or action on climate change?
Now, this is the question I get in the pub all the time, and I'm going to give it to you, Helen.
Okay, so I think the first thing is it's kind of one of those myths, isn't it? It's a really good cop-out. I don't have to do anything because, I mean, look at America and look at China. And actually, the two are completely different. China has got a slightly bigger per capita carbon footprint than we have, but not particularly big, much bigger. They are using coal. They are transforming into a more modern industrial society. I don't know that we have the right to say, well, we're industrialised already, but you lot can stay living like you are. The other thing is, when they do decide to do something, by God, they act quick over there. So, whereas here, it gets discussed, it goes to a cabinet meeting, it goes to a da-da-da-da-da-da. If they decide next week they're going to fix something, they'll be starting it on the week after. So, I think we've got to give them the chance to get themselves where they need to be. They've done an awful lot of building, and we've just said concrete causes an awful lot of that. And, of course, the other thing is industry. Half the industry you're wearing.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Actually, this one's Turkey and this one's the Philippines. But yeah, you do.
They have brought the price of solar panels from there to there. So I don't think we should be criticising China, at least not yet. Now, the other one, Donald Trump. Ooh, how do we put this? I think it's up to our government to call out the racist little twat that he is. Right.
And I'd also like to hear from Josh on this one. Josh, what do you think we should be doing? Because people do feel a bit... I mean, Helen's made a very good case. What do you think?
Yeah, well, likewise, I hear this one a lot. I hear this argument a lot. I think there's several problems with it. Helen's touched on a few of them. China is leading the world in renewable by far. They're also leading the world in reforestation and afforestation. Their investment is more than the rest of the world combined at the minute in renewable energy. And also, we've got to remember that they're a poor country going through the earlier stages of development. And what matters for peak warming is cumulative emissions. So all the emissions that we've produced historically, Britain's got the highest per capita historical emissions in the world. Europe and US historic emissions dwarf anything that China has emitted. And all that embodied energy has built our economy and is the foundation of our wealth and our privilege that we have now. So if the commitment to equity in the Paris Agreement meant anything, we would be building their renewable infrastructure for them. But that's not going to happen, is it? But also, I think it just... The issue of why... Also, the question was, why should we do anything if they don't? I mean, obviously, the US is a different picture. The Republicans are just committed to concentrated wealth and corporate power and dismantling any kind of protection for the environment as quickly as possible. However, let's just grant that that's the case, or let's argue that they change and an energy transition isn't possible, and we do end up with, large degree of warming. I think that question comes down to a misunderstanding of the nature of the predicament that we're in. And this is not helped by a narrow focus on CO2 emissions, because climate change and CO2 emissions are just one symptom of the problem. We live in an economic system that is deep into overshoot by just about everything that you can measure. So if you look at the ecological footprint accounting, currently the world system is it's using 1.7 Earths worth of resources every year. So that's not just what the environment can assimilate in terms of pollution, that's also non-renewable resources that we rely on that are being depleted very rapidly. It's the natural resources that we rely on for our food. If the rest of the world does continue on as it is, what are the consequences going to be for us? It's not a choice between continued business as usual and action on climate change. It's a choice between choosing to try and have a controlled contraction of our ecological footprint or letting nature do it for us, which won't be enjoyable. So the things that we need to invest in, like local food, local energy, are things that we will need even more if things get really bad. So that's the reason why we should be pursuing local action.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's brilliant. Now, I've got a question from Matt Keddy. Is Matt here? Matt's right at the back there.
Hi. Oh, yeah, it's working. I'm not used to speaking in front of lots of adults because I'm a primary school teacher. But bringing me on to that, what are we doing to educate children through practical activities? Because we all know how persuasive children are. They can make you do things that you wouldn't even think twice about that it's ever going to happen. Anyway, I know that they can... If you persuade children to do things, I think even the most stubborn granddad can get making eco bricks or something like that, whereas under no circumstance would he have ever believed that he would be doing that with his grandchild of 6 years old. So I think we should be working with children to actually educate them and make them be persuasive and change people's habits.
That's fantastic. The reason why I chose that question, there were lots of questions about kids, but I keep getting asked this about, what should we do about education and so forth. And I say, I can't wait for the climate strikers. Much as I love the climate strikers, I can't wait for them to be in power. It's old people, as old as me, who've got decision-making power, who've got to get on with it. So you're totally right. It's about getting through, via the children, to their parents and their grandparents. And I think that's really quite exciting. So that's why I wanted to ask Matt Carmichael about that and how that would work in the classroom. And we think whether we would be able to get them to educate upwards.
Yeah, well, I just want to preface it by saying it's not just schools, is it? Educating children happens in the home, it happens in your communities, it happens in your faith communities. So all of those people need to be involved. But schools have, a huge job. And really, ultimately, what we do in the classroom is empower children in a multitude of different ways, isn't it? And now we need a massive focus on empowering children to know what is going on in their world, and I think there's a massive challenge there for schools because we are not really educating our children properly about this climate emergency that we're in now. So schools need to look at their curricula, how they're delivering, what's in the national curriculum. But there's so much opportunity there. Kids need to be growing food, they need to be planting trees. They need to know things like, how their vote is going to affect their future. They need to be educated in how the politics of these things work. We need to lower the voting age. I'm absolutely fully signed up to that. That's one of the demands of the youth strikers. Lower the voting age to 16 because those young people are the ones who are going to pay for the consequences of the decisions that we make now. So there's just a vast amount of work. Now, schools have been massively overloaded for many years now, with huge pressures on, coming on the league table system, on Ofsted and all that. But I'm starting to see now much more interest from school leaders and school staff in how are we going to, respond to the fact that we're now in a climate emergency. So we'll be working very much in the Leeds Climate Commission to help that process. Our future Leeds is going to have a school strand, and we'd love parents and community groups and teachers and students to all get involved with that when that starts to take shape. But I think perhaps another really crucial thing to say is schools do not have the capacity, the workload capacity, the money to take on another huge challenge by themselves. And I have already said to senior school staff, and I will continue to say to senior school staff, you need to ask for help from your communities because you will find willingness there, but that's your job, right? When they come to you and say, we haven't got the workload capacity to decarbonise or to look at our curriculum and how we're going to change that. When they ask you for help with those things, are you going to be there to support schools to do those things?
That's great. Thank you so much. I'd just like to say, I run a network of local authorities who are making the commitments to do this, and I know that the officers and the councillors are calling us up saying, We are making this commitment because our own children are demonstrating against us outside the town hall, right? So that is a literal movement. That is why the school strikers are so important, because there's nothing worse. First they're outside the town hall, then they come home, they're all over Insta, and then they're going to tell you about what a fabulous day they've had, telling you how bad you are. So that's always a good way of creating political pester power. Now we've got Amanda Seams. Amanda, have I pronounced your name right? Amanda, great. You've got a question.
So my question is, what steps are we taking to support every resident of Leeds being able to safely travel by foot or bike to their place of work or education? And just as an example, I work up on the Leeds Ring Road near Leeds Lawnswood Business Park. Thousands of employees, most people drive. It's considered a very dangerous road for cycling, and my daily experience confirms that. It's also a very heavily polluted, noisy and unpleasant road for walking. So most people think, as a minority to cycle, most people think you're quite crazy for doing it. So how can we change some of those things? Also Lawnswood School as well.
Councillor Mulheron.
Thank you very much, Amanda. We're doing an awful lot of work. We have a lot of catching up to do in terms of improving cycling and walking as options in Leeds. We've got a Cycling Starts Here strategy with aims. We've got 170 miles already of cycle lanes built in Leeds. 500 miles is our ambition, and we're working on it. We're already improving and increasing the amount of that that's actually segregated cycle lanes, which I think is a huge, huge difference. Somebody who is not a very confident cyclist, actually not having to run the gauntlet with buses and lorries on the main road actually is a significant difference, actually. So we are doing work with schools. I'm a bit biased. I don't know where the colleague is who asked the question about schools now, but I've spent the last 3 years leading our Child-Friendly Leeds ambitions. We do work with schools to train children on their cycling proficiency. We also work with adults who need to build their confidence in terms of cycling. There are schemes across Leeds that people can sign up to, supported by British Cycling, to do that. We are also trying to make the city centre safer when you get into the city centre. So we've got a scheme of work that's taking place now, which is leading to some roads being closed to through traffic. And ambitions to make more of that and to make it safer and more attractive to people to walk around the city. We are investing £270 million over the next few years in terms of bus improvements as well, so people can walk, get on the bus and then walk again at the other end to work or school or college. So we're doing all of those things. We know that there's a long way to go, but the investment is there from the council. We are calling for more resources to be able to build on that work from central government. And I think the other thing to say in terms of the city's capacity, there's been a massive growth in cycling in Leeds in the last few years. And part of that is the legacy of the Tour de France Grand Départ in Leeds and the work that's come out of that in terms of us having the World Series Triathlon running here, in terms of having the Tour de Yorkshire here, and having the Tour, the schools Yorkshire Tour as well, that's encouraging more children to consider cycling, and that's our cyclists, walkers and sustainable transport and active travellers of the future. So there's an awful lot happening, still a lot to do, but we need to continue to build on that, and there is a real commitment from the council to work with people to enable us to do that and to build on the work that we're already doing.
Great, thank you. What about Josh? Josh, what do you think about this?
Yes, so I know the council's fairly limited in what kind of structural changes they can make and things like that. But I would like to see much more pedestrianisation, perhaps closure of roads just for certain days, like has been happening across lots of cities in Europe, move towards more permanent pedestrianisation, and trying to eventually quite rapidly shift the infrastructure so that we've got better public transport, but also things like, and I know the council doesn't have any control over this, but structural changes to the economy so that people don't have to be coming into the city every single day. You know, one of the things that would be a big help in reducing our impact would be reduced work hours, a shorter work week. You know, several studies have shown that a much shorter work week could have a big impact. You know, a lot of economic activity is frankly extremely harmful and not necessary. It's all in pursuit of more growth and more profit. If people had less money but more leisure time, you know, things like basic income so that people don't have to be working 40 hours a week, those kind of structural changes are the real big impact things that we should all be pushing for. And, you know, I'd like to see the council supporting those calls, even if they can't make the changes themselves.
That's great, thank you. Interestingly, in the Olympics in 2012, everyone was so freaked out in London about having all the crowds that they all stayed at home and worked from home, and people got used to it. And that's actually meant that the income for TfL, Transport for London, has gone down because people have got used to doing remote working, and therefore there is less pressure. It doesn't feel like it, frankly, sometimes, but there are fewer journeys because people have started to do that. Now, it's not the same as in the universal basic income, it's not the same as a 4-day week, but it is interesting how some of those things can flex. Right, our last question, and I am slightly over, but not, I'm going to just go with it. What, Paul Weatherly, who can't attend, so this is the last one, what part will tree planting in the city play in reaching the 2030 target? Now, that's first for Polly.
Hi. Well, I think we need to be realistic in terms of there are certain technologies that aren't going to reach zero carbon by 2030. So if we want to be net zero, there is going to be an element of offsetting that will have to play a part. So something like, for example, our gas infrastructure by 2030 in all our homes is unlikely to be replaced. So there will be an element of offsetting, and at the moment we're looking strategically across all the sort of city, looking at things like the flood alleviation schemes and seeing what we can build in. So I think it will have a key part to play, but amongst in a kind of balanced way.
Great. And then can we have briefly Rizwan, sorry.
Yeah, so I'll probably wear my scientist hat here because I've done research over the years looking at disappearing green space, so we all know that. Green cities are great cities, but unfortunately there are worrying trends. So a study done about 10 years ago looking at gardens shrinking, gardens disappearing. Recent study looking at green spaces attached to schools, again because of pressures, school numbers, etc. Those spaces are shrinking, disappearing. So on that front, I'm a bit sort of pessimistic in terms of what's happening to urban green spaces. And again, from Medina Town Movement, it's engaging with certain communities and trying to understand what the pressures that they face. Certain communities are sort of, in terms of green space, struggling to retain those green space. When you look at this spatially, there are swathes of areas where green space is disappearing quicker. Understanding that, why is that happening? In terms of the second part of the question, the effect that trees have, we know that trees are good, and I've done sort of looked at globally, date palm trees, for example, in the Middle East can have a huge impact in terms of carbon sequestration. Very recent research is showing, this is a bit controversial now, but I thought this is a great platform to share this. This is a conversation. So very recent research is showing that carbon emissions are definitely obviously a cause of global warming. There's actually something we're looking into, which is the loss of earth insulation. So it could be, this needs a lot more investigation, but I have published a study where it's a two-pronged attack on the earth now. So we've got carbon, the fossil fuels act as insulation. So they're actually insulating the interior of the earth's heat from rising to the surface. So that could be a contribution to the global warming we're seeing, and some early sort of studies suggest that that is the case. And if that's the case, then carbon sequestration techniques like planting trees and stuff is great, but we might need to put those sort of fossil carbon back into the places where it's actually taken from.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rizwan. Thank you. And can I just say, can we all have a big round of applause for the super panel? We had 45 questions tabled. I managed to get through about 12 of them, which is it's pretty good, but I know there'll be loads of other questions, which is why it's so good that this conversation is running on until October. But we've talked about trees, we've talked about bikes, we've talked about better jobs, we've talked about safer streets, we've talked about healthier lives, we've talked about what kind of city we want to be. And in those, that's really what this conversation is about. This is an opportunity to reshape our city rather than simply talking about less, but doing things differently in a way that rewards us for the things that we really value, which is time with our families, making sure that they're healthy and safe and secure. So these are the ways that we can all get involved. I don't think the opinion poll is working because of the technology. Oh, it is? No, it's dropped because, yeah, the technology's failed us. We'll find another way of doing something like that another time. But you've got the questionnaire, and we've got an opportunity to make the video as well. And that means that this is just the start of something. Can we also have a round of applause for you, because you've spent a long time tonight thinking about this and how we're going to do it. So give yourselves a round of applause. One of the questions was about eco-anxiety. I didn't want to raise it because I think it makes us sometimes really miserable, but I'm coming away from this evening extraordinarily optimistic. You know why? Because if there is this amount of energy in Leeds, imagine what that kind of energy is like all over the country. This isn't the only place this is happening. This, you know, I know Leeds is special. But the important thing about this is that Leeds might need to be a leader, but it can't be the only ones. Can I just lastly hand over to the leader of Leeds City Council, Councillor Judith Blake, for her final remarks about this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here to close this event tonight. Polly and I have worked together for too many years to mention on this agenda, and it's such a privilege to have her here tonight. She's asked for you to thank everyone apart from herself. Can I ask you all to thank Polly for coming here tonight? So, I came thinking of things to say, and listening to the last part of the debate, of course, all these things come to the surface. But, you know, Polly and I work very closely together on, do you remember when Ed Miliband had the portfolio, on the Green Streets Initiative? And Green Road in Cookridge was chosen to take part in this national competition to show how homes could act themselves and make the difference. And just picking up on the comments about young people and their motivation, the competition that developed between the households on that street, and you know, every day, you know, kids pedal cycling to get the electricity, to generate the electricity to watch their TV programs. All of these things, but that just incredible collective issues that came out of that, and you know, really coming up with solutions. I think it's extraordinary that it's taken so long from all of the early interventions that we tried to make to really capture the imagination of so many people. But I think this is the moment. I think we are here now and we have to seize it. I would ask all of you, and thank you, as Polly said, each and every one of you for coming here tonight. We all have a huge responsibility. Can I ask if there is anyone in the audience tonight who has come here sceptical about the climate change agenda, the need for us to declare climate emergency? Not a single one. Well, I have to say, I think that dictates to us the task that we have ahead of us. I work on a national platform with other local authorities. We had the AGM of our local government association 2 weeks ago, and I was very proud to second a motion, the first motion we'd actually had to the General Assembly of the local government association for years, bizarrely. And we achieved cross-party support without one council, without a single council going against what we were proposing. Firstly, to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think that's a really important aspect of what we have to do. And also, for all those local authorities right across the country to declare climate emergency. I know, and I'm sure there were some councillors in the room who were very reluctant to sit on their hands and do exactly that, but they did. And I think that's the power of where we are now. So that is what I'm doing at a national level, but obviously working at a local level as well. And I would just ask each and every one of you to think about your sphere of influence, where you can have the most impact, where you can go out and actually talk to people who don't either understand what the problem is, or indeed that their lives are so stressed anyway that they find that they have very little time to recognise just how relevant this agenda is to their lives. And we have to go out initially through this 3-month consultation period to reach as many people as we possibly can, to get their views, to understand, if you like, some of the barriers that we're going to be facing in bringing about the change in behaviour that we need to bring. It is huge, it is immense, and we have to go out there, and most importantly, we have to find a way of speaking in a way that is relevant to people's lives. So when I talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, it is so important that we talk about tackling poverty, about really addressing the fact that in a city like Leeds, it is the people who live in our inner city communities who actually suffer the worst impacts of emissions, for example, and all of the other associated events and things that you've been talking about tonight. So we need to go out and talk about fuel poverty, as well, of course, as carbon emissions, but fuel poverty. Make sure that we make what we are doing on behalf of the carbon reduction work really resonate with people's everyday experience. We can do this, but it's going to take effort and imagination to really get out and reach the people that we know we need to reach to make the difference we have to make. As well, it is important to talk about the economy. In Leeds, we now have 3 pillars that we're working to. Inclusive growth. So we do talk about growth, but we talk about it in the context of really addressing the fact that too many people in our great city are not able to benefit from the opportunities that we have here. It's about tackling poor housing. It's about tackling the fact that kids don't have the skills they need to access the jobs, many of the jobs that we're creating. The second pillar is our health and well-being strategy. I believe that one of the reasons this has, the whole agenda of climate change has really gone up and achieved notice from people is the fact that it is now so directly related to people's health. And that has cut through in a way that we could never have imagined. The fraud that car companies like VW committed in falsifying their data around diesel emissions. Actually, we have to get hold of that and change it. So the third pillar, I'm delighted to say to you tonight, is the whole area of climate change and what we need to do, recognising that we have declared climate emergency and what we need to do flowing from that. So what we have to do is talk about the social impacts, the environmental impacts, but as I said, let's look at the economy as well. The enormous potential that we have to convert our economy to really take advantage of the opportunities through a Green New Deal, green economies, completely changing the energy base of everything that we do, whether it's domestic fueling our homes or businesses. These are enormous opportunities with great potential to provide the jobs of the future. So I'll just leave you with this thought. of how you are going to go away from tonight and actually reach out and find people who you need to talk to convince that they need to be involved, and how you can do it in a way that reaches them and gets them excited and enthused as you all obviously are. But what I hope you have learnt tonight is that Leeds is taking this agenda very seriously indeed. As Polly said, we are recognised as one of the lead areas in the country for much of the work that we have done this far. We want to keep that position, and we want to keep pushing out the boundaries and doing as much as we can to move quickly and at pace. And through the work with the Climate Change Commission at the university, we are really working up the roadmap and a plan for actions that we have to take forward. So I would just leave you and say the time for action is now. So let's get on with it. Let's get out there. Let's start the conversations, and let's get the permission from the people of Leeds to make the changes that we know we need to make. Thank you very much.
I thought I'd finished my job, so I'd taken my mic off. But Laura, you're going to do a quick wrap-up on what you've been doing. I've been sort of paying a little bit of attention during the conversations. Would you be able to just give us a little bit of a summary?
Yeah. Oh, that one. Hello, everybody. I was attacked with 2 microphones then, so I'm a bit scared. Thank you all for being so engaged and articulate and clear, which makes my job easy. So I'm going to go through this really quickly because I'm conscious I'm between you and a glass of wine, water, bed, Love Island, whatever. So we first started with Keely's video on the impact of climate change, and I think the thing that I took away from that specifically was that it's having a dramatic impact on our food production and our economy, and that's having an effect directly on people and the way they're living their lives. Then Andy talked to us about how we have a climate emergency, and this is having a significant impact on our crop yield and on our food security, and that actually we need to have the courage to change and to make these changes structurally and at a top-down level as well as a down-up level. And then Lisa talked about, scared me actually, is that if we don't act in now, in the next 10 years, we're going to face the biggest risks of climate change if we don't act now in 10 years' time. And our main aim is to be carbon neutral by 2030. I put 2020 there, which I think is a bit of a... I was going to say, Leeds are good, but are you that good? And how are we going to do this? We're reducing emissions. We talked a lot about better transport, housing, and how we can involve the community in that as well. Then my hand slightly fell off, and I managed to get it back together for Andy's talk about the carbon roadmap, and that from 1990 we are 50% down on emissions, but we need to be down by 85% by 2030. And how are we going to reach this really ambitious target? By using those common sense things. So what can we do on an individual level to start to lower our consumption? And also what about the deeper political, economic and social issues to get that last 15%? And a key thing that Andy talked about was we don't want it done to us, but we want to do it together and for us. And then Richard talked about the Yorkshire Water's commitment to be reducing their carbon footprint. And actually, currently they use 280,000 tonnes of carbon. But actually they want to reduce their carbon footprint again by 2030 by looking at carbon absorption. And I'm sure that's very scientific, and I'm not 100% sure what that means, but it sounds very good. So then we had our future leads, and this is where I had 2.5 minutes to make sense of something. So there was a talk there about using a democratic approach and involving the community to drive climate change. So there's community focus with the idea of holding people accountable so stuff actually gets done, and also developing the climate change hub to start those conversations. We then had the Medina Town movement, which is talking about how the Muslim community is using faith to drive climate change around these 5 particular values of justice, peace, unity, freedom and compassion. Then we had our breakout sessions, and I had the pleasure of staying here for the Big Carbon Literacy Game Show, which I thought was a 50s television programme, clearly. And we were looking at, actually, do we know what the carbon cost is of the things we do on a daily basis? And so Dave went through using balloons, which is incredible, to demonstrate the difference between our meat consumption, tumble drying, flying, driving, and weirdly feeding the cost of a dog. So flying was one that we all thought was going to be a big carbon footprint player, but actually feeding a dog for a year was greater in terms of carbon consumption than flying. And I got to draw a dog, which is great. So Dave was talking about the importance of being carbon literate and what that means for organisations and trying to improve that. I'm loving that you're all laughing at my dog there, but I tried my best. Then we moved swiftly on to our amazing panel session. Now, there's a lot on here, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But what I was hearing a lot of was kind of change at sort of 3 levels, at this individual level, at a local council level, and also at a broader structural level, with behaviour change driving some of that, and also thinking about different areas of the community that can work together to improve that. So both from schools and children to faith communities. And I think, again, a core thing that came out was just talk to people. I think you said it, Helen, get out there and have these conversations, because that's where we need to start the change, is in behaviour, and everything else will follow. And then finally, Judith summed up really well that Leeds is taking this seriously, and that the time for action is now, and that we all have a huge responsibility from going away from tonight, and that we need to exploit our spheres of influence for change. Again, pulling up on that idea of talking to people. We need to talk about the economy, we need to talk about our community, and we need to talk about fuel poverty. And we talked about these, saying the word talk too much there, but pillars for change. So poverty in the economy, health, and climate change is now one of these pillars for change, which I think shows a huge commitment from Leeds to do this. But thank you for having me.
I'm supposed to be telling you about questionnaire. I think I did mention it in the slide before you all go. No. On the YouTube channel. There you go. Big Leeds Climate Conversation questionnaire. That's the one you need. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you get home safe tonight, walking, cycling, or using a bus, preferably, in this very well-connected city. Thanks again for all of all your contributions, and remember, the conversation only starts tonight. Thank you.